All right, next section we're going to take a look at has to do with Windows security settings. And we're going to start out by looking at the different types of user accounts that we can have. Now, keep in mind that we are talking about local user accounts here, not network accounts. So if you are in a domain environment, you might also have additional accounts on the machine, but those are domain accounts. Here we're talking specifically about local accounts. So the first one is an administrator. They have complete access to your particular computer and basically can do whatever they want with it. There are certain limitations, but basically for the purposes of our discussion, they have complete access to the machine. The second type of account is only available on Windows XP, not available after Windows XP, and that's a power user. Power user basically could do some of the things that an administrator could and not some of the things that an administrator could. So it was right in between a standard user and an administrator. The next type, of course, is a standard user. Standard user is set up so that they can use most software on the computer, either by running the program or if the program requires administrative authority, doing so and putting in the administrator password. This type of user account is sometimes referred to as a non-privileged user account. And then finally, you have a guest account. Every time you install Windows on a machine, the guest account is there. Okay? Now, the thing to keep in mind, and this started with Windows Vista, is that when you install either Windows Vista or Windows 7, you are requested during installation to provide a username for an additional administrative account, just like you were in XP. The difference here is that the administrator account is disabled by default, as is the guest account. So what I usually tell people when they ask me about this is I say, okay, well, you can do one of two things. When it asks you for the username for the administrative account, just put in something like test, and as soon as the machine comes up, log off or go in, activate the administrator, maybe rename the administrator, and then delete that account that you put in there during setup. Otherwise, just leave the administrator account alone, because if somebody's going to break into your computer, one of the first things they're going to look for is an administrator account. And if you are using an account named administrator, they're going to go, whoo, I'm halfway there. All I need now is a password. So either leave it disabled or rename it if you're going to activate it. Something that came along with Windows Vista, and this was probably among others, but this was one of the reasons why Vista basically fell flat on its face, is because of this user account control. And the user account control basically ruled everything, and you had no way to change it. Well, that is not true in Windows 7. In Windows 7, you can, on each individual machine or by group policy, you can change how strict the user account control is. And basically, you're going to get one of a couple of different screens when the user account control shows up. If you are an administrator or you're a member of the administrator's group, but you're not the administrator, this is the screen you'll get. So basically all they're saying is, hey, the user is you're trying to run a program that I know is supposed to be controlled by the administrator. Do you want to just go ahead? And you click continue and off you go. If you're a standard user and that happened, what would happen is you would bring up a logon, basically a logon box that would ask you for an administrator account and password in order to run that particular program. There are a couple of things that you can control with the user account control, whether it's enabled or disabled, that's one of them. And what is the behavior for an administrator versus a standard user. And you can also set application-specific behavior, whether it kicks in or not. Okay. So as I mentioned before, anytime you see a program or a item in control panel that has a little security shield next to it, that tells you that it's going to require user account control. All right, let's take a look at another type of account. It's a group account. By default, when you install Windows operating system, there are certain built-in groups that are automatically created. The first one is the administrators group, which by default has whatever name you provided for an account during installation and the administrator as members. You have a guests account. A guests account is where you keep all of your guest users. Let's say that you have a contractor that's working on a project for a few days, doesn't need a lot of access, just needs to be able to get on the network maybe. You can put them or activate them as a guest user or with a guest account. The power users group. Power users, again, is XP only, or I shouldn't say only. XP is the last operating system where it's available. The users group, which is everybody. So when we are looking at security in Windows, one of the things we want to look at are the system files and the system folders, how they are being accessed. So you can go into a My Computer or computer window and look at system files. It depends on what that setting in the file and folder options, what that was set to, if it displays system files or not. It's usually a good idea for a user who is not knowledgeable and not experienced to hide those system files and folders so that they can't get at them. Now, there are different types of or different ways that you can look at files on your machine and different ways you can create a file. One way to create a file is simply right-click on the desktop. On the pop-up menu, select New, and then one of the options is File, and it'll create a new file for you. And you have options for text file or different types of files. So in Unix, for instance, you can create a file by using the touch file name command, and you can also create files in Unix by using the cat command or CAT and redirecting that output to a particular file name. Okay. So when we are looking at files themselves, one of the tools that we can use for looking at files is Windows Explorer. Now, something that is new with Windows 7 is the concept of a library. And a library, and by default there are 4 libraries: documents, music, pictures, and videos. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to gather files from multiple users and put them in one spot. So you put all their documents in one spot, all the music, for instance, pictures, and so forth. So it allows you to create or see files in more than one location. Even if you don't connect it to any other user or any other computer, this is still a quick and dirty way for you to get to your documents folder or your music folder when you're trying to explore the various windows. Now, you've heard me refer to this before, computer, my computer. In Windows XP, it's my computer, my documents, my music, my pictures, my videos. All they did in Vista, starting with Vista, is drop the my. Well, they did a little more than that. They dropped the my, and instead of under my documents, the pictures and music folders were underneath my documents. Well, now they're on the same level. So it's computer, documents, pictures, and videos all on the same level. Or I should say the same disk level. I've mentioned this before, that it is a good idea when you are looking at the display settings and the file display settings that you deselect the option of hiding files of known file type. This list right here gives you a very small list of typical file extensions that you're going to run into. .txt, RTF, and doc are all document files. BAT is a batch file. bin is a binary file. .com is a command file. .exe is an executable file. .dll is a dynamic link library. The .hlp and .chm are help files. HTM and HTML, those are web pages. .inf is an information file. .ini is an initialization file where you're initializing a service. .msi is a file that is a Windows installer package. Then you've got a .sys or system file. Then .tiff, JPEG, GIF, so forth. Those are all picture extensions. And then .xls, .ppt, and .mdb are Excel files, PowerPoint files, and Access files in that order. Now, something you should know if you are using Windows 7 or using Office 2010 is that, actually it started with 2007, is that you'll see .xlsx, pptx, and what it is it means that is a XML file. And don't worry if you don't know what an XML file is. You don't need to worry about it, except with the file extensions on these particular files. File attributes. A file, as well as a folder, but we'll stick with files for right now. File may have certain attributes attached to it, and there are basically 5 different file attributes. A, H, R, S, and I. A stands for archive. What that means is if you are using Windows Backup to back up your files, that tells Windows Backup that that file needs to be backed up because it's changed, or leave it alone because it hasn't changed. Hidden file, can you see it or not? Read only is means you can only read it, you can't change it. S is a system file, and I is a file that's been indexed to speed up the search process. Now, with the various Windows file system types, and these are referred to as file system types, you have from the earliest days FAT, F-A-T, which was for floppy disks or very small drives. FAT32, which was enhanced for larger drives. And NTFS, recommended for most Windows-based computers that are running today. The only time you're going to see FAT32 or FAT is if you're, like it says, working with a very small disk, or the only I have seen FAT32 used is if you're creating a bootable flash drive to boot into an operating system. But most of the time, you're going to want to use NTFS. One time, I just out of curiosity, I said, what does NTFS stand for? It's really original. It stands for New Technology File System. You can also have CDFS for CD-ROM, but when you're working with hard drives, the typical one you're going to want to work with is NTFS. And one of the main reasons you want to work with NTFS is it allows you to assign permissions to particular files and folders. When we talk about permissions, let's say that we have a particular folder, and that folder can be, doesn't really matter, but you'll notice that we have 3 groups here. We have administrators, user 01, and contractors. Administrators have full access. User 01 has read-only access, and contractors have no access. So, and in reality, there are 2 ways that you can, quote-unquote, deny somebody access to a file or folder. One way is to just simply not assign them any permissions. Okay? If it's an individual user, just take that user off the permissions list. Or there is a deny option in the file permissions. The problem with the deny option is it's a lot more powerful than people think, and that is that deny permission, if you deny somebody permission, that overrides any permissions that the person has from a group or from individual on that particular folder or file, because deny overrides everything. So the basic permissions for NTFS are read, write, read and execute, modify, and full control. And read permission is pretty self-explanatory. It means I can read the file. Write is self-explanatory. Read and execute mean I can read the file, and if it's a program, I can execute it. Modify means I can modify that particular file or its permissions, and full control. So those are the 5 major categories of permissions in NTFS. Now, each one of these has subcategories of permissions, but these are the 5 that you need to remember. For folder permissions, we have list, folder contents, read, write, read and execute, modify, and full control. Now, those are basically the same permissions as with a file, except with one exception, and that is list folder contents. If all I've got is list folder contents, all I can do is look at what's in there. I can't access any files, I can't access any folders. All I can do is list out the contents of that particular folder. Some other things to keep in mind with permissions, and that is that unless you specifically tell it otherwise, permissions are propagated down the folder chain. If I give somebody full access to a file at the root of C, any folder, any file or folder that's contained below that, that's added below that, I automatically will have full access to. Now you can change individual permissions for a file or folder, okay, and block the inheritance from coming down, and we will take a look at that in just a minute. Shared files and folders. Now, with shared files and folders, you have shares can be on folders. They can be, you can share a printer, or you can share a drive. There are also what we call administrative shares for various drives on your computer. Now, an administrative share is created for every time you create a drive, C drive, D drive, whatever it might be, it's going to have an administrative share. And an administrative share is delineated from a regular share because it has a $sign behind it. So, for instance, for the C drive, the administrative share would be C $sign. An administrative share, A, is only allowed or only accessible by an administrator, and B is hidden. When you list out your files and folders, you don't see all the administrative shares. Now, with NTFS, we have not only the NTFS permissions to deal with, but also share permissions as well. And there are 3 basic share permissions that you have in NTFS, and that's read, change, or full control. Okay? Read, you can view file and subfolder names, run program files. It's granted to everyone by default. Change, perform all read permissions and add, change, delete files and subfolders. Full control, we can perform all read and change tasks as well as change permissions on that particular folder. Okay, so we've got these NTFS permissions and we've got share permissions. How do they apply? Well, NTFS permissions apply to the actions users can take on files and folders locally. If I'm on my machine and I'm trying to access files or folders, then only the NTFS permissions apply. Share permissions apply to folders, subfolders, and files that have been shared with other users and are accessed on the network. So if I'm going to, let's say we've got a a file server and all of my documents are stored on the file server. Well, then then the share permissions apply as well as the NTFS permissions. So you can have NTFS and share permissions on the same file or folder. So you might be asking yourself, okay, if I have both types of permissions on the same folder and I'm accessing this share over the network, how do I know what permissions apply? And it's the most restrictive. So let's say I have a user named Chuck, and I'm trying to access a folder over the network. And my share permission for that folder is read, but my NTFS permission is full control. I will only have read permission on that folder unless I was accessing it right at that computer. So it's the most restrictive permission is going to apply. Some considerations when we are talking about permissions. Allow versus deny. As I said earlier, if you need to deny somebody access to a particular folder or file, the easiest way is to simply just not give them access, period, on the permissions list. However, there might be a time where, let's say you have a group called accounting, and in that accounting group there's a miscreant named Chuck who you want to deny access to. Well, you don't want to take the accountants list or the accountants group off the permissions list. In that particular case, you could add the Chuck account and deny access just to that particular account. All right, there are also considerations when you are moving and copying files and folders. And when you move a file or folder from one folder to another on the same partition, it retains the permissions that were applied at its original location. When you copy a file or folder from one directory to another, it inherits the permissions of the destination folder. And when you move a file or folder between partitions, the result is similar to copying a file and folder. It will inherit the target's permissions. So when you're copying a folder, it always inherits the permissions of where it goes. When you're moving a file or folder, if it's in the same partition, they retain their permissions. If it's in a different partition, then it inherits. So the only time that permissions are inherited from the destination is when you're moving a file or folder to a different partition. Now notice I said partition, not disk, just a different partition. All right. You can also, we talked a little bit about files and folders or file attributes. We can manually set those if you want. Again, there really shouldn't be much of a need to do that, but you can do it if you want. We talked a little bit about permissions on a system. Well, before you can even look at what permissions somebody has, you first have to authenticate the user. And usually that's done through the use of a password. Computer says to the server, "Who am I?" The server says, "How do I know?" And then the user responds with a username and password. Now there are other ways, other devices that you can use for logging in. Some computers come with fingerprint scanners. You can use other biometric devices to input a username. In fact, Windows 8, you can use a picture as your quote-unquote password to get into the system. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at both NTFS file permissions, file and folder permissions, as well as share permissions on a computer. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and create a new text file on the desktop here. And for our purposes, we'll just go ahead and call it test. Okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and open up the file and put a couple of words into it. Now, if I want to look at the permissions that are assigned to that particular file, if I right mouse click on it and then select Properties, you will notice on this screen here that one of the tabs says Security. So if I go ahead and click on the Security tab, the first thing you'll notice is that by default there are two groups added to the file with permissions, the system as well as the administrators group. But what I want to look at is first is my permissions. So I know I happen to be the app dev user. You'll notice that under permissions, you'll notice all the permissions are grayed out. That's because by default, when I create a folder or a file under my user account, it inherits the permissions from the level above it. If I wanted to change that, and you'll see here that I've got full control, modify, read and execute, read and write. Okay, basically everything. But if I wanted to change that, what I could do is go ahead and click on the Advanced button. And you'll notice here, again, it lists all the users and their permissions and says what folder those permissions are inherited from. Okay, so for instance, the app dev user is inherited from the C:users app dev user. Okay? But if I wanted to, I could go ahead and change those permissions simply by clicking on Change Permissions. And you will notice it brings up the exact same box, except now I have an Edit button, as well as the check mark that's right below the Edit button that it says Include inheritable permissions from this object's parent. So if I wanted to give the administrators group, for instance, no control on this particular file, I could go ahead and do that simply by selecting administrators, deselecting the checkbox, and it gives you a warning message saying if you proceed, the parent permissions will no longer propagate to the object. And I click Remove. And you'll know that no groups or users have permission to this object. However, the owner of the object can assign permissions. Since I created the file, I can give permissions. Click on Add. Okay. And if you happen to know the name of what you wanted to add, you can go ahead and put it in here. If instead you want to search for it, you can click on Advanced and then Find Now. And it gives a list of all the different names on the computer. So I find my app dev user, click OK, click OK again, and now I have to tell it what permissions I want to give. So if I want to give full control, I simply click on the full control button. Okay. At this point, if I click OK, and click OK, and click OK, you'll notice that even though I still have the same permissions, you'll notice that those permissions are no longer grayed out, which means that I'm not inheriting them from the level above. So when you combine or when you give permissions, obviously giving permissions to an individual user is not very efficient. You would rather give permissions to a group of people. And you can assign those same kind of permissions to groups as well. So what I'm going to do here is, let's see here, go down to New, Folder, and we'll just call it a dummy folder. And I'm going to go ahead and go down to Properties. And I'm going to go ahead and create a share out of this folder. Now, the easiest way to do that is there is the Sharing tab up above. I click on Share, and then click on Share again. Okay. And it's asking, who do I want to give permission to on this share? Okay. So if I type in administrators for the administrators group, by default, the only permission level they have is read. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. Go ahead and click Share. Shows me the shares folder is shared. Click on Done, and then click on Close. Now, if I go look at the permissions on the dummy folder, or the properties, I should say, if you look at the screen here, you'll notice that the administrators group only has read and execute, list folder contents, and read on this particular folder. Okay? And that is because those are the share permissions that they have on that particular folder. Now, if I take the test file, the test document, and I'm going to move it inside of the dummy folder. Okay. Now, let's go inside the dummy folder and look at security here. You'll notice that even though the administrators group has read capabilities on the folder, it still does not have any permissions on the file itself, because I had removed all the permissions and just put the appdev user there. So you can see where permissions are inherited. We took them off so they weren't inherited. Then we moved that test properties file inside a folder that the administrators group has read permission via the share, but because they have no permission on the file itself, they still have no permission. It's the more restrictive of the two permissions that is used. So let's go ahead and close out of that. All right, let's look at the permissions on the folder here. You'll notice here administrators only have read and execute, list folder contents, and read. So if I want to change that so it propagates to the file below it, click on Advanced and go to the administrators group right there. Click on Change Permissions. And this time we want to include inherited permissions from this child's parent. And we can also replace all child object permissions with inherited permissions from this object, but we won't do that. We'll just include the inheritable permissions from the object's parent. And click OK. And there, now the administrators group now has full control on that folder. But still has no permissions on the file because I didn't pass it on down. Okay? If I would have passed it on down to the child objects, you would see the administrators group in here as well. When you are looking at allowing or denying permissions to a particular group or a particular user, you'll notice you have both an allow column and a deny column. In this particular case, because the administrators group is not there, that would be the same as adding them and doing explicitly check on the full control deny checkbox. The easiest way to deny permissions is to do that. Just do not even include them in the security tab on the properties window if you don't want them to have any permissions at all.